My name is Mae Brussell. The title of the broadcast is World Watchers, and it is program number 826. It is October the 5th, 1987. There was a group of people that met this past weekend for the Robinson Jeffers Festival. I don't know how many of you World Watchers are interested in Robinson Jeffers. I didn't recognize any of you there. You might have been there. But he happens to be one of my favorite poets, a very important poet, and it was very nice to spend Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon listening to some of America's really great poets talking about Robinson Jeffers and reading their poetry. An important thing about Robinson Jeffers is his concept about the world in general and the unique significance of California in terms of the world, and I think it's very pertinent to things that I'm seeing in the news all around me at this time, and since I've been studying history, I realize how important he is. The essence of Jeffers is that California is the place where Western civilization, he says, reaches its geographical, intellectual, and spiritual end. And he thought of himself as a product of civilization. And I'm citing a book about Robinson Jeffers that summarizes him better than I could in paraphrasing it, and that as an artist, he wanted to acknowledge the fact of what the Western star meant that directed people west. He said that light guided civilization in its long migration out of Asia into the Mediterranean, into Europe, across the Atlantic, across America, and then right back to the Pacific shore. And he asked, where will that lead us now? And Jeffers was a person who felt that the past and the history of the past was wrong. It didn't make sense, and that Western civilization was coming to an end. He saw that after World War I and wrote about it. He said revolutionary discoveries in almost every area of thought and expression along the violent upheaval of World War I rendered inadequate many of the assumptions about life engendered by Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian tradition. And certainly World War I was an insane war. World War II was worse, and now we're on the verge of World War III. He said that these assumptions that we had before are inadequate, and that life is not as described for the causes or reasons for these wars. And he said people believed the tradition would have to be abandoned. He and his friends and fellow poets felt it was necessary to abandon tradition or at least transcend it in order to recover authenticity and truth. And this is what we have to do at this time when there are so many lies going on in the newspaper every single day and disinformation. And along with T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Wasteland, Eliot felt that the great ideas and monuments of the past have been reduced to a heap of broken images, and that where cities once stood, and he cited Athens, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Vienna, and London. You could say Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, if he could see them today. They've all become unreal. And in describing the world, T.S. Eliot and also Robinson Jeffers thought it was a state of mind, pardon me, that you have to get away from the backward look behind the assurances of recorded history. And that is very, very important as we share history each week on the air. This unusual project of sharing it with you every single week for 16 years, that you have to get over what is called the recorded history and get some sanity in what Jefferson, T.S. Eliot, and others refer to as a primitive terror, which is a sophisticated emotion involving the humbling of oneself before the mystery of existence, not having all the answers that Judeo-Christian religion have, but the mystery of existence, and be able to surrender your presumptions and be willing to look at life with a more innocent view. None of this is certain, and you're in trouble when you accept the history that's been handed to you. And as I say, I enjoyed Saturday going to the festival and hearing poetry in the morning and afternoon. It is good for the soul, and it's a very good balance to the research that I do or that any of you do when you listen to this broadcast, to have these kinds of balances and be in tune with some of the greatest minds in the world, particularly one that created right here in our own area and described so well, starting just during the period right after World War I, to what we're seeing today. He understood it perfectly. And there were a group of 5 renowned poets who read at the group meetings, and 2 of them were Pulitzer Prize winners, 2 or 3. It was really a wonderful day, and maybe next year, if you see it, I'll tell you in advance, and you may want to share that with me. Well, today is an anniversary. It's October the 5th. It's the anniversary of the landing of Eugene Hasenfus, the Southern Air Transport, left in Nicaragua, and it dumped, in Nicaragua, left El Salvador October the 5th. And since that date, we've had a lot of Iran-Contra to separate the assumptions we've had, the history we've had, the history we're going to have. Has to be all checked and balanced, and it has to be based upon some of your own innate knowledge, not what these pathological liars would have you believe. One day before the plane dumped Mr. Hasenfus in Nicaragua, the Southern Air Transport had a crash in Texas. And this was a Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio. It was transporting arms to the Contras. And immediately I believed that something was going to happen in terms of what unloaded later, because a gentleman on that airplane who died was Leon Mulcahy. I've tried to find out if he's related to Kevin Mulcahy. Kevin Mulcahy was the man who was murdered just prior to the trial of Edwin Wilson. And this airplane went down in Texas with Leon Mulcahy. Kevin had a brother, 2 brothers, and a father in the CIA. And the following day is when 4 people flew off from El Salvador, and 3 of them were killed, and 1 survived, Mr. Hasenfus. And with those consecutively, one day after the other, I just, not instinctively, but realized this whole story was going to link to Stanford Technology Trading Group, to the Edwin Wilson, Frank Churchill operation in Los Gatos, the Albert Hakim operation, the original Otto von Borschwing network, and the early broadcast, I referred to it as the International Fascista, and now more and more material is coming out along those lines, finally. The unanswered questions about these incidences the first 2 days will remain never part of Bob Woodward's story or William Casey's, and I'll do more about that later, because I gave Danny Sheehan, back in February, the question about Leon Mulcahy. Was he related to Kevin? And also the 4th person on the airplane that crashed when the airplane from El Salvador was destructed over Nicaragua. The name of the 4th person, I can't verify, just a obscure name was given in U.S. News, a 1-sentence report that I had on the air. But for all purposes, the Leon Mulcahy, October 4th, 1986 crash has never been confirmed or denied, and I've tried different sources to find out, including Representative Henry Gonzalez from Texas, and also the 3rd person who died on the airplane that blew up over Nicaragua. There was a CIA gentleman, William Stewart, very high up in the intelligence operations in Southeast Asia with the secret team. There was a William J. Cooper and a 3rd person, but the parts left out of these stories are these other names that may take it to a different dimension or place. So at the time that this airplane was blown up in Nicaragua is the time that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and Mr. Cave and Secord were opening a 2nd channel in Frankfurt, Germany, October the 5th, and when Robert McFarlane of the National Security Council was taking a Bible and a cake to Iran for the Ayatollah. There was an Iranian interviewed on television this week, I forget who it was, who was making fun of Ronald Reagan. They said the Bible was written in English and not in Farsi, and it was a joke to everybody, autographed by the president. And the cake they threw away because they thought there might be poison, and they have a good, healthy paranoia because it just might have been laced with that kind of CIA acid or whatever. So they threw the cake away. That was smart. And also, the story began to unfold at that time when Mr. Hasenfus had the names of people high up in the White House directly linked to George Bush, the vice president, and then within a short time, the Lebanon newspaper broke this story. And I'll do more about that in one moment. Last week on broadcast 825, I was talking about William Casey, cited in Bob Woodward's new book, Veil, The Secret Wars of the CIA, being recruited by William Donovan in 1943 for the purposes of putting the OSS in Berlin into the Gestapo offices, etc., before the war was over, a month before the war was officially over. In 1943, Fritz Kraemer recruited Henry Kissinger. In 1943, Alan Dulles of the OSS moved to Bern, Switzerland, to arrange the post-war Nazi links. And in 1943, the Nazis went underground. And I'll do more on them later. I just wanted to share you a little bit of that chronology this week about Henry Kissinger's military service in lieu of those dates. A World Watcher listener wrote to the Pentagon and also to Germany to get information about the German Fritz Kraemer. And we have a little tiny bit about the American Fritz Kraemer. If they're not the same person, I would be very shocked. But the statement from the military service of Henry Kissinger, just quickly, said that he was inducted into the Army of the USA February 26, 1943. That's just the time that William Casey was recruited by William Donovan to get into the OSS. Kissinger, February 28th, was inducted. He was transferred to the Enlisted Reserve Corps on the same date. He went into active duty March the 5th in 43. He went to Clemson College in July of 43. He went to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. In 1944, he was assigned to the Company C 335th Infantry at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, where he met Fritz Kraemer, the German with the monocle, who recruited him in 1944 in April. And he departed the United States in September 29, 1944, to go to European Theater, the 84th Counterintelligence Division, and Fritz Kraemer was in the 84th Infantry Division. They were together. Now, they arrived in Europe in September 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, where the top Nazis merged with the United States Army under the long-laid plans of Alan Dulles of the OSS and William Donovan and the Vatican and Ernest von Weizsäcker, and I'll be doing more on that later, took place just 3 months later. Kraemer and Kissinger arrived in Europe in September 44. The Battle of the Bulge of the merger of the Nazis took place in 4 days from December 20th to 25th, 1944. And by January the 1st, William Casey and the OSS had all the top Leibstandarte, the top Nazis, recruited that they could put in the Gestapo offices in Berlin, waiting for the official war to be over by May the 8th. The Army record said Kissinger was discharged May 23rd, 1946. So he had 2 nice years in Germany, and he was stationed in Frankfurt on Main, which is the home base of Peter Drucker, who brought Fritz Kraemer to this country, and the notorious Fritz Kraemer. He was located in Frankfurt, the Army paper said, and then he was appointed a second lieutenant of the military intelligence in 1948, and he went to Harvard as a part of the military, which is an interesting fact that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't read his military record. He went to Harvard College in 1947 under the military service, listed under military service from the Department of Defense. Henry Kissinger was there. He was at a city college in New York, 41 to 43, and he was in business administration with no degree. Whenever you want to know the profile of an agent in residence, whether it's a local one or a well-known one, you go through their chronology and you find what I call those missing 2 years where they get their training for their very important espionage work. And Kissinger's 2 years were 41 to 43 in business administration with no degree. If he's so action-oriented and so brilliant, he wouldn't have wasted his time unless he knew there was a future. 43 to 44, he was in an Army specialized training program as he connected with Fritz Kraemer in Pennsylvania. And the military awards he got, he wasn't in any battle. Of course he wasn't in any battle. This Henry Kissinger, you can't visualize it. But the military awards he got for going over there, actually the 1st of October, and the war was over, there was hardly after the Battle of Bulge any battle. The Germans merged with the Americans. Henry Kissinger got the Bronze Star Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle East Campaign Medal, which I don't know what that was for, but the Army says he got it. He got it with 3 Bronze Stars. He got the World War II Victory Medal, the Army of Occupation Medal with Germany. He got the Honorable Service Lapel Button for World War II, And guess what? The sharpshooter badge with rifle and carbine bars. It reminds me of Lee Harvey Oswald as a sharpshooter in the Marines. Henry Kissinger, the sharpshooter. And then he got some overseas bars, and he got the Meritorious Unit of Commendation, and then the French Croix de Guerre. So those were the list of his medals for the time that he sat over there in Europe. And then the same listener who got a pack of information on the German Fritz Kraemer and on Henry Kissinger, a package of material, finds that Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's favorite Nazi, who worked with Otto Skorzeny and Sepp Dietrich, who was in the Battle of the Bulge, where the 6th Panzer Division merged with the American Army, where William Casey could pull his members of the Gestapo into the Berlin police offices. Hitler's top general only was in the Army from 1943 up to the end of 1944. The Army records have him June the 20th, 1943, and also January the 9th, 1943. So he became a top general with no background at all, and there's no record of what he did in a military sense. And that's the time period where I believe he was in the United States connecting up with Henry Kissinger and preparing what they would do with the world when the war was officially over. Hitler's top Fritz Kraemer has no history of any operations in South Africa, Eastern Europe, France. His friend Sepp Dietrich has a military history going back to 1928, as do all the other people and defendants in the Dachau trial, but not Henry Kissinger, not Fritz Kraemer, not Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kraemer. He's only visible in the uniform 1943 and 44, and that's the time period where the American Kraemer connects up with Henry Kissinger. For new listeners, and they're new listeners all the time, I'm updating a story of Hitler's top general, his favorite top general at the end of the war, a man named Fritz Kraemer, and a man behind the career of Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, who I believe, for every reason that I can see and find, is the same person from Germany, from Frankfurt, Germany, who was sent to America to work with top, if you can call him an American. Henry Kissinger came from Perth, Germany in 1938 and was ready to connect with these people within a very short time. I've done many, many broadcasts on that, and if it's vague and you're new, you'll just have to bear with me, and if you want back broadcasts, they are available. Early in this year, I brought up the material around February of an item in the newspapers in Argentina that was covered on CNN News, that Adolf Hitler died this past January in Mendoza, Argentina, and a lot of the material is based on the work of a Dr. Robin Dorian, Director of Forensic Dentistry, Minister of the Solicitor General in Quebec, Montreal. There was a convention, and outside of World Watchers and CNN, this subject has been very suppressed. But Omni Magazine, this current issue, October 1987, page 39, has a picture of Hitler's imposter, asking, was the corpse an imposter too? And asking, is the Hitler corpse a fraud? Did the Fuhrer make off to Argentina? And it implies that this particular Dr. Dorian from Canada seems to have the answer and knows, but he's not ready to put the speculation in public. But the evidence, the dental records of both Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler are absolutely ruled out if that was a source of identification, and the corpse was not available in terms of identifying Hitler or Eva Braun. There were just a lot of ashes. Now, just one quick item or two on Fritz Kraemer. Another listener got me some more material. One has to do, he was more public in 1966. Maybe he was around more, but I wasn't aware of him. But I received from somebody several pieces of news. One is a Rampart College newsletter, the Freedom School. Rampart College is a small college, and Fritz Kraemer attended a policy on foreign affairs. This is back in 1966. He was with Frank Johnson, former Naval Intelligence Officer, Richard Allen of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. Allen became the first national security advisor for Ronald Reagan, and Sven Kraemer, Fritz's son, was on the National Security Council, may still be, and Fritz Kraemer was advising the Security Council in 1981, and Richard Allen and Fritz Kraemer were speaking with a group including William Rickenbacker, the editor of National Review. That's owned by William Buckley, who set up Young Americans for Freedom in 1960, with not only William Buckley of the CIA, but Ronald Reagan on the board, and Fritz Kraemer was part of the organization, being a lecturer. Also, there was a newsletter from Freedom's Facts in December 1967, a symposium that talked about campus unrest, and the person giving the lecture or writing for this particular newsletter was Reed Irvine of Accuracy in Media, and I have linked him on other broadcasts to Fritz Kraemer and the Intelligence Network. And also a seminar was conducted at St. Joseph's College by Dr. Fritz Kraemer. This was in December of 1967. But then there was a report put out January 12, 1976, called Here and There, a right-wing report, which I thought was particularly interesting for several reasons. It includes a newsletter regarding Fritz Kraemer, but it was put out in conjunction with the National Association of Manufacturers, modeled after Sun Oil Company's plan to influence Federal Election Commission for the next election. And the head of Sun Oil, one of their executives, is Hans Senholz, who's on the board of Western Goals. And then an item in this newsletter Here and There says, Pentagon defense scholar Dr. Fritz Kraemer briefed the Senate staffers, of course, on the grim outlook of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Reds. And there's a paragraph on his speech against the Russians, the Soviets. And then the very last sentence of this very far right-wing newsletter that has nothing to do with anything but what the very right-wing are doing, it says, rumors reaching Washington from Minneapolis suggest that Hubert Humphrey's recent operation for bladder cancer was not entirely successful. Translated mean Hubert Humphrey would die of cancer. Now, in Germany, in the rearming of Germany from 1919 to 1929, there were the deaths of over 400 political persons who were wiped out that would oppose the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Reich. And so by 1933, Hitler could be elected. So I believe that cancer has been known to be a disease that can be transmitted with injections. And a lot of political people have died of cancer. Philip Hart of the Senate, Frank Church of the Senate, Jacob Javits had the Lou Gehrig's disease, and Hubert Humphrey was one of those wiped out by cancer. And what they have in this is a message that Humphrey's going to die of cancer. And I thought it was interesting putting it at the bottom of the newsletter that only cites these far right-wing groups and their speeches as if to give them a message. Now, one of the listeners to World Watchers called the talk show the program last week or the week before about Frank Carlucci, and he sent me a copy of what he was referring to that is very, very significant for the matter of Iran-Contra affairs in Washington, D.C. It comes out of Aviation Week in Space Technology, July 13th, 1987. Frank Carlucci, he describes himself, and there's a picture, chairman and CEO of Sears World Trade Incorporated. He doesn't say of the National Security Council. This is July 13th, 1987. He's been NSC director since January of 87. There's a picture of Carlucci, and it says, we need retired managers who are ready to roll up their sleeves again. I'm a volunteer supporter of the International Executive Service Corps, a not-for-profit organization with a vital mission. Just to stop there, Richard Secord was in the Air Force until 1983 when he officially resigned. Then he went working for these anti-terrorist covert operations that got involved with Iran and with Nicaragua and a lot of other countries also. And Secord was part of the government, or he was, in quotes, not on the payroll. He was, in quotes, retired, but he and his gang, Secord and Hakim, have $8.6 million put away in Merrill Lynch in London that they're fighting to hold on to. So nonprofit for the moment becomes profit, and retired doesn't mean a thing, because you can retire from one branch of the government and still go on to another. Now, Carlucci said, we send retired U.S. managers overseas to help business in developing countries, which often respond by increasing their import of U.S. goods. In fact, developing countries consume 40% of the U.S. exports, probably weapons, because Sears World Trade is a weapon manufacturer, and these people are not getting much except weapons for their money. The ad says, as an IESC volunteer, you would not get a salary, but you would get your expenses for you and your spouse, plus a world of personal satisfaction. IESC leads the field in this kind of work. We've done over 9,000 projects in 81 countries. We could have a project that's just right for you. To find out, send this coupon to Frank Carlucci, Chairman and CEO, Sears World Trade Company, P.O. Box 10005, Stamford, Connecticut, and it's got the zip code. Now, he isn't telling you, or putting there, that he is the National Security Advisor. This is the top spy agency with its little pocket, I call it, supersedes me. It's gang that are so secret even the NSC doesn't know what they're doing. He's running an ad here for what could be the massive amount of new secret team, new spies, because over Frank Carlucci, over him, is the mysterious, quiet, very seldom seen Eric von Marburg. When Carlucci was Deputy Secretary of the CIA under Jimmy Carter for 2 years, he then went on to be Deputy Director of the Defense Department for 2 years. Then he went on, after he was with Reagan, 1981 and 82, to represent Sears World Trade, where Eric von Marburg, the mysterious von Marburg, quietly recruited him, and this is an arms business. And von Marburg is linked to Stanford Technology Trading Group, to Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, to the group that were forming that company, EATSCO, that was sending arms to the Middle East after the Camp David Accord with Thomas Klein, Theodore Shackley. And when they were going to be investigated, it was Michael Ledeen that went to the Justice Department that got them off. When Edwin Wilson was arrested and brought home from Switzerland, he was brought under the company of his friend Ernest Kaiser, or Robert Kaiser, he called himself. Then it turned out he was Ernest von Kaiser of the Wehrmacht. And with Fritz Kraemer and Ernest von Kaiser, the question is, who is Eric von Marburg? The top researchers, including Danny Sheehan of Christic Institute, and Jim Hogan, who wrote Spooks, and Frank Turpel, who's in touch with Jim Hogan. The big secret, the question about Iran-Contra, has a lot to do with Eric von Marburg, so that this man can be recruiting out of the National Security Council to turn over the answers to Sears World Trade. He's running 2 operations at the same time that can go in the hands of von Marburg. And these men, if you can call them that, came out of Stanford Technology Trading Group, which was formerly International Imaging, which belonged to Otto von Borschwing of the Waffen-SS, of the Gestapo, who set up his headquarters in California, who had his translator as secretary to Reagan for 8 years out here. And I have to keep going back to that network of the secret team, because here is a man from the NSC using his name, using that company, for these purposes of setting up another secret team that can literally rape the third world, wipe out the middle class, kill the political opponents, have secret teams and death squads getting rid of all opponents to people, which they are doing, people like Pinochet and so forth. A man can be reelected because there's no middle class to stand up. There's no middle class in the Philippines to support a change after Marcos. So this is a very serious matter, and I appreciate the person who sent it to me, and I want to tell you to keep sending me that material. It's very nice. Now, I want to take this moment. We have a 1-minute break here where I ask you to take notice of certain current things. A listener called me today and said that there's going to be a meeting at UC Santa Cruz. Dale Van Atta, the partner of Jack Anderson, will be speaking October 13th. I can do more in the talk show part of the program. This is a week from Tuesday at Kresge College, UC Santa Cruz, and it's free. This is a chance to meet Mr. Van Alta, to ask questions, to open up new issues about Kramer or Kissinger, to get in their consciousness, and it would be a good chance for you to meet him and hear him. Jack Anderson does put out some very good material that nobody else dares to put out, and some of it is working with the CIA and so forth, but others materials the most courageous in the country, and he consistently does it. And I'll take this 1-minute break again to thank all of you. Subscribe. The major newspapers carried the story, but I just want to go over it again of several, one death and one near death. The Lebanon journalist, the man who revealed the Iran deal, was shot in the head, 4 bullets to the brain. Mr. Hassan Sabra, he's the one who wrote in the Beirut weekly magazine, the Shiraa, Shiraa, that the money, the United States was transferring money and arms to Ayatollah Khomeini, and after he revealed the U.S. arms sales, he was, as I say, shot September 15th, 1987, in the head, neck, and chest. They say he will probably be blind if he recovers at all. He hasn't passed away yet, but he's in very bad shape. And then some listeners called in because this just happened last Monday. Just before I went on the air, the newspapers had the story about the firing squad in Iran that killed the Iranian who exposed the arms, when the word leaked out about the arms deals. Then the gentleman, Mehdi Hashemi, was murdered with the firing squad. He was accused of all kinds of charges, including the plot to overthrow the government of Iran. And they lined him up, put him in the prison, and shot him after he revealed the secret trip of Robert McFarlane and the U.S. arms sales to Iran, which Ayatollah Khomeini wanted, but also because he was planning the overthrow of the government. There have been many articles and pieces of evidence that the moderates that the White House was talking about were the former or present Savak, just in different clothing, and that they were supplying the weapons so that they could attack and kill Ayatollah Khomeini and put in the government that America wanted to deal with. So Khomeini isn't stupid. He took this guy and shot him. He was working with Americans who did not have the interests of Iran in mind, and they wiped him out. So one of the fellows in Iran was killed for, I think, the evidence of trying to overthrow the government. That's what the LA Times newspaper described. Some of them didn't put it that way, some did. And the other one for revealing America's selling arms to Iran. Last week I talked about Mr. Gorbachev, who was still hiding after 52 days. He hadn't been seen. He surfaced this past week after a long absence. And in Europe, in the Soviet Union, they didn't explain what the long absence was about. But similar to his illness or whatever it was, there was a story this past week, October the 1st, 1987, Legionella bacteria linked to the death of Henry Ford II. Henry Ford II contracted pneumonia and Legionnaire's disease while on a 10-day European vacation. According to his doctors, he was sick for 2.5 weeks and died. But I guess I know somebody who had Legionnaire's disease or was diagnosed as having that and survived it. Some make it and some don't. But there is this possibility that the same thing could have happened to Gorbachev that happened to Henry Ford II. Also, in the weeks when he was missing, there were articles, I'll just cite one, there were many of them, cautious superpowers look to the new era of détente. And all of those missing days, 52 days, the various newspapers, and I could cite them over and over, were breaking down the idea of peace talks. And I referred to what happens to people who want peace talks, such as the breaking up of the meeting of Khrushchev and Eisenhower with the U-2 being down and so forth. This is a common factor that's happened since World War II, that the Cold War has to keep progressing to be a hot war. And so the Gorbachev story ends well. He's alive, and now we'll see what the skeptics do about the peace talks. There was an obituary in the Washington Post that was interesting because it reminds me of conflicts I've had with peace organizations, my own personal experiences here on the Monterey Peninsula. This is nothing personal, but I just want to cite this particular obituary so people get a view that things aren't always as you think they are, or as Robinson Jeffers says, sometimes you have to forget the written history and look a little closer to facts that you have to be able to accept that the world isn't always as you think it is. There was an obituary in the Washington Post of Dr. Bryant Minor Wedge, 66, and it describes him as a psychiatrist and an authority on peaceful resolution of conflict. He played a major role in the establishment of U.S. Institute of Peace, a nonprofit corporation funded by Congress. The Institute opened in 1986 to find ways to settle disputes between nations without violence. In 1976, he won the National Peace Academy campaign, a citizens organization that called for the creation of a national agency devoted to resolving conflicts peacefully. In 1979, he helped organize the Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. So far, so good. Then it goes on to say, Dr. Wedge, in addition to being a psychiatrist working for peace, was an advisor to the United States government. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He developed psychiatric profiles of leaders and other people. He was interested in the resolution of conflicts since 1959. He lived in Europe, Africa, and the Soviet Union. But he worked with the federal government. He served the Army from 1952 to 54. He was assistant chief in the Army of Psychiatric Services at Valley Forge Army Hospital in Pennsylvania. And in 1954 to 1960, he taught at Yale Medical School. He was in the psychiatric department. Well, in 1950 is when Dr. Delgado, Jose Delgado, came from Spain and was very much active in those same years, and a well-known person in Yale University psychiatric department, identical years that this gentleman was there. Delgado began experimenting with the electrodes in the brain and said the world is too complicated for a man to have the right to make his own decisions or to use his own mind, because we're so minute that we're not able to use our own minds. And what I'm trying to say is that there are some peace people, and I'm not going to name them by name, who absolutely are brittle when they see Mae Brussell. On this peninsula, they're, in quotes, the peace activists, not the ordinary people that just join and march, but the leaders. And some of them, I know for a fact, have contacts to the military and the intelligence community. And their behavior is such that they don't want to see me at peace organizations or peace groups, or if I took the bus to San Francisco for the peace demonstrations, not this year, but last year. And there is a large development in every so-called middle or left of intelligence, Defense Department, and intelligence people who direct what the individual groups can think, and then they can also break down persons like myself who have ideas about peace as not being believable and not credible. In fact, one of the leaders of the peace group on the peninsula told me it didn't matter at all if Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's top general, ran our Pentagon today. I was in his home in Carmel, and that's what he told me. I left that home and hardly speak to him. If I don't have to, I don't acknowledge his existence. But this obituary is typical of what you have to deal with in organizations that want change. They're not what they appear to be. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be part of them, because we need them in a way, but you have to go beyond them. And when they make these aspersions or these claims, you have to challenge them, and if they can't back them up, get new leaders. If you can't get new leaders, do it yourself. I believe in people power, that people can do things themselves. You don't have to depend on people telling you how to think or who to listen to. And that's very, very important if you have any chance at all of saving this world, which is, the chances are getting pretty slim, even though Justice Bork won't probably be confirmed. We'll do more later if I have time. Now, Nancy Reagan, according to the L.A. Herald and a syndicated story in the Associated Press, I've mentioned it before, she wants Ronnie to have the Peace Prize. The newspaper article I have says Nancy has eyes on the Peace Prize. It's reported that she has begged and asked wealthy industrialist Armand Hammer to enlist in talks with the Nobel Prize officials at a meeting in London. She made up her mind that Ronald Reagan is not going to leave the White House. After 8 years in the White House with the stigma of Iran-Contra, she's convinced that he can bring an end to the Gulf War. Now, Armand Hammer is the closest friend to the Soviet Union that they have had from the Western world, starting with the day the revolution happened. Armand Hammer believes in trading with the Soviet Union, with dealing with them. He's one of the wealthiest men in America. He didn't lose money doing it, and he opened up a lot of frontiers. Ronnie has made a career of hating the Soviet Union, talking about the Soviet Union, promoting the Cold War, and working with those warriors and SS Gestapo and Waffen-SS agents who just please him to no end. And he asked Mr. Armand Hammer, with his close dependence and relationship to the Soviet Union, this old fascist now, wants to remember it as a peace guy, and the irony is that he goes to Arm & Hammer. Years ago, he wouldn't talk to Arm & Hammer with his linkage in and out of the Soviet Union. He flies in and out with his own private airplane. Ronald Reagan, running for governor or president, wouldn't think of it, but he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He goes to Arm & Hammer. That's what Nancy wants. Well, one way for him to get it is start bombing the Persian Gulf, bomb their head off, and I'll cite some current articles on the Persian Gulf, because remember how Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize when he didn't tell Congress that he was bombing Cambodia and pouring hundreds of millions of gallons of Agent Orange in Southeast Asia and overthrowing and taking over Laos and Vietnam and defoliating and bringing all the narcotics traffic. That's what got Henry Kissinger the Nobel Prize. So in this crazy world of images, again, in order to ground yourself in a little bit of sanity, if there is any, that's why I cited just a little bit about Robinson Jeffers. There's a lot more. But as far as the Gulf, I could spend 8 or 10 hours doing it. I just want to cite 3 or 4 articles about the Gulf. One is the LA Herald Examiner, September 28th. A lot of these are syndicated wire service. Iraqi warplanes assault 4 tankers with Exocet missiles. Iraq can do anything. Iran can't do that. Nobody says a word. September 28th, last week. Following that, September 28th. Following that, October the 2nd, syndicated story, U.S. secretly encouraging Iraq. Sources say, and this is a long story out of Miami Herald on how we're helping them. September the 1st, 1987, and this has been going on continuously, showdown over the War Powers Resolution. The president wants a complete say on how we start this war, and that's what he wants. Nancy wants the prize. He wants the war. Miami Herald, September 24th. Don't limit my authority to deploy Gulf forces, Reagan tells Congress. Don't tie my hands. And that doesn't look like a peacemaker to me unless he wants it the way Kissinger got it. Then another article, September the 6th. The USS Stark's readiness criticized in report. And I believe that the Stark was a sitting duck, an excuse helped out by Iraq to do what they did, and then we, in turn, would begin putting our ships all in the Gulf to get ready to aim for Iran, because as we heard over and over with the Iran-Contra hearings, it is strategically located on the border of Russia, and anything that's strategic, America wants. And this sounds just exactly like the Adolf Hitler takeover, and that's why it's important to continue the pursuit of did Hitler die in Mendoza just this year, which sounds silly to some, but all of a sudden, even Omni, a scientific magazine, is posing the question and showing a picture of the double. And this article talks about how the Stark was poorly equipped. It lacked the power tools to locate the fire that was on there. The Stark members were forced to use sledgehammers and axes to cut through the metal bulkheads. The ship lacked breathing equipment for the sailors to fight the fire. The crews were poorly trained. The breathing devices that provided oxygen for 1 hour ran out in 22 minutes. The electric plugs that would use for the fire equipment didn't match the Stark's outlets, and several men donned emergency breathing and were trapped and died because their equipment didn't work. Also, this past week, September 28th, there was a long syndicated article. Iran seamen say the United States offered asylum after we took away their ship and sunk it in the Gulf, and we said that they were locating mines that were photographed, and then we couldn't find the pictures. They said, do you want to come to our side? You know, these are people laying mines who weren't held as prisoners for laying mines or causing any problem. And the surviving crewmen said they were offered American citizenship. Come on to our side. So those mines must not be very bad if we want them working for our side. We don't have the pictures to prove what they were doing when that ship was sunk, and we were hoping to get a few Iranians. They said no thanks and went home. Then another story in the San Francisco Chronicle, September 30th, Fort Apache set up in U.S. foreign forces in Gulf. Now, Oliver North wanted a Fort Apache in Nicaragua. He didn't get it. He wanted it, but now he has it. His westward movement is being achieved in the Persian Gulf. And this story says the United States is converting a huge barge into a floating fort in the central Persian Gulf for Navy minesweeping. The Navy has leased the barge from an undisclosed source, probably Saudi Arabia again, possibly an oil company, after Kuwait refused to allow United States forces to set a base on its soil. And again, if this isn't insanity, and I think of what Jeffers said so many years ago, we're putting American flags and crew on their oil tankers. They are using their oil profits to buy up American land, real estate, businesses, and also in London. And they said, you can't use our place to land your ships. No way, not in Kuwait. You protect us. Who is giving the orders to the Pentagon is an interesting point. Now, a 100 by 400 foot fortified barge called the Floating Fort Apache is in international waters. And again, a quotation from this story: we need a mothership, a base with piers and a place for crews to sleep, for helicopters to land. We tried Kuwait and they wouldn't let us. This is the next alternative. And to repeat again, Kuwait said if their ships are attacked or bombed, they will not fight or go after Iran in this matter, that it is a matter between America and the Soviet Union. And this is getting into Reagan's Armageddon psychology. As Nancy wants the Peace Prize, this is a situation where we now Fort Apache. Now, the westward movement not only came all the way to the California that Robinson Jeffers learned to love and appreciate, but now it's going east over to the Persian Gulf, or you might say keeps going west now. The westward movement has come to California, and then the next jump is to the Persian Gulf, where the cowboy and Indians continue, and cowboy and Indians was one of Adolf Hitler's favorite subjects. He had a museum for Mr. Mays, who made many, many movies about the cowboy and Indians. So over there in the Persian Gulf, we're continuing what I call the Nazification of American foreign policy, and having even the name Fort Apache, which is such an insult over there in the Persian Gulf. Then another article this past week for Nancy's Peace Prize: Reagan is upheld on nuclear testing and chemical weapons. In a vote in Congress, 62 to 35, in the democratically controlled chamber, they voted that there would be no moratorium on testing nuclear weapons, and then Ronald Reagan could continue the production of new chemical weapons. Some wanted a halt to the production of Big Eye nerve gas bomb, but the chamber killed by 52 to 40 margin and proposed 1-year moratorium on all this. And what the president wants, the president gets: Iran-Contra or nothing else. There are tremendous pressures for the Congress to show we're not afraid of conservatives, and they're giving Reagan everything he wants. And to add to that, Richard Nixon was involved in advising the president in the past few weeks. A September 29th story, San Francisco Examiner: Nixon wanted Reagan to get tough in the Gulf. Well, he's got Fort Apache, and he's got his chemical weapons, and he's got the ships over there. And Nixon says, you've got to get tough and stay over there. And he called the Persian Gulf a crisis that is difficult and complex, but we've got to be there. Richard Nixon was a part of the whole William Rogers. William Rogers was the attorney for the Shah of Iran. He was the attorney general under Nixon. He's a partner of the laws of William Casey. Richard Helms was ambassador to Iran. The whole team of the Nixon operation before the Reagan was very much working with the Savak, the Shah of Iran, with this military dictatorship. Once the Kennedys and Martin Luther King were killed and buried, then the government was literally turned over to these monsters. And he is writing press releases on how Reagan should run the Persian Gulf, identical to the one he ran in Southeast Asia without the approval of Congress. And the president, again, wants his war powers without us butting in. The newsletter Washington Spectator had an article September 15th, 1987, and it cited Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas saying, we're repeating what we did at the Gulf of Tonkin. Once an American ship is hit, or at Kuwait, there will be an emotional splurge of outrage and patriotism that authorized the president to escalate the war. Everybody remembers only two senators, Senator Gruening and Senator Morse, who voted no to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They stand out today in history as two men who, had they been listened to, would have saved 57,000 American lives, 750,000 broken bodies in whatever was the most debilitating war in U.S. history. not to speak of what we did to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this article in Washington Spectator has a scenario about the Iranians attack a U.S. ship or Kuwait tanker with Americans aboard, and we respond, and this gives us a Gulf of Tonkin chance to get into the war. And the San Francisco Examiner has a full page across the top of it, big black letters, September 29th. Nixon on what to do in 1988. Ex-president gives intimate memo to various candidates advising them on what they should do. He's the person in residence who is so great at giving his advice to other people. Now, there are several books out. The new Bob Woodward one, The Veil, The Secret History of the CIA, that is causing so much interest and commotion, and I'll do maybe in the remaining minutes a little bit about Bob Woodward in that book. But there also is another book that I haven't mentioned on World Watchers yet. Some of you have and some of you don't, called The Iran-Contra Connection, Secret Team and Covert Operations in the Reagan Era, written by Jonathan Marshall, Peter Del Scott, and Jane Hunter. It's $11, and it is a very good book going back to the early history of the Iran-Contra team. Of course, it isn't a complete book, but it's a good book. It's similar in character to The Great Heron Coup by Mr. Kruger or Spooks by Jim Hogan. It is a book with information that gives the background of who these people are, how they connect, how long they've been together, their interrelationship to the government, to drug traffic, this secret team that works for the World Anti-Communist League, these clandestine operations that are all tied into Reverend Moon, the National Security Council. And what you get from this book is a sample or particles of things most of you've heard on World Watchers, or material that I've had that I haven't had time to put on, but will share with you. It's bound between the covers of a book that is easy to read, that tells you about the operations of the government I call it the Nazification of America, coming out of the Otto von Borschwing network in Los Gatos, California, the International Imaging, the Transcomputer International, the Reinhard Gehlen operation, and how this secret team works. They don't identify the Gehlen operation. That's their cutoff. Everybody who writes on these matters, for the most part, has a cutoff where they won't dare touch. And the advantage of being a world watcher is you hear the rest of the story. You know, the radio program where you hear part of it, and then you hear the rest of the story. I can tell you the parts left out, but it also doesn't mean it isn't a good book. And I suggest that you get this book. And also there's one called The Chronology, a book put together about very, very important parts of the Iran-Contra story. And Jonathan Quitney's new book out on the links of the Iran-Contra secret team to Nugan Bank. So, and we have Bob Woodward's book. So that's 4 giant blockbusters there that would keep any conscientious person busy for a whole year if nothing else happened during the year. Now, this past week, Pat Robertson had a victory in Idaho. He seems to be very big in one small part of this country, but he's growing a lot of momentum. And they played back on television in Los Angeles videotape showing Pat Robertson leading a faith-healing revival. This was reported in the L.A. Times, October the 3rd, 1978, at a time when Republican presidential candidate Pat Robertson wants to de-emphasize his evangelical past. He is confronted by powerful visible images of a 1981 revivalist faith healing. That was the year Reagan was sworn into office, where he cured on the spot cancer, hemorrhoids, goiter, bad teeth, and a list of about 21 ailments. And there's a videotape showing him healing these people, telling them that God is working and that he sees these illnesses in them and he can cure them right on the spot. Now, a lot of experimental drugs have been put out for AIDS, and people are arrested for making them or trying them. The AMA has admitted it has harassed chiropractors for the past 17 years. There's been a repression on alternative types of medicine that could possibly help somebody if they're dying of AIDS anyway. What is the difference? Excuses that will give them false hope. But do you think Pat Robertson is giving them hope? And the AMA has been harassing chiropractors, who are a necessary part of our lives, I believe. And here is a man who's running for president who is not picked up by the AMA telling people to throw away their medications, that he is healing them. And they're playing these tapes. He summons up for prayer 21 different diseases and afflictions. He says on the tape, and many, many times, I tape recorded his television where he's talking about healings. God has healed someone of a concussion, a fractured skull. The Lord healed him. That God is healing you. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for healing the hemorrhoids. I think it would be very important with Pat Robertson running as president to ask those people who were healed to step forward and check their medical condition and see if, in fact, Pat Robertson was a fraud. It seems to me that what he is doing is worse than having Pat Schroeder cry for the fact that she decides not to run for election at this time. Pat Robertson also suggested and encourages the invasion of Nicaragua. His biography includes working for W.R. Grace and Company. I'll do more on that later. And Pat Robertson also said that if he were president, he would not appoint an atheist. Well, my time is up. I am going to discontinue this broadcast because the hour is winding down. And the next hour is yours. This is your chance to call in, Kazoo 375-3082, and ask questions. And this concludes the first part of World Watchers.